In the grim darkness of the far future, the battlefields tell stories of crumbling strongholds, shattered defenses, and cities turned to dust. Today I'm building a set of ruined concrete walls that look like they've been through years of war. I've previously made another set of concrete walls and they ended up being some of the most useful terrain I've ever built. They're extremely versatile and I use them in almost every game. But this time I'm going for something way more elaborate, more in the style of the Warhammer 40k universe, and packed with little details that bring the battlefield to life. I started by sketching a bunch of designs for the walls. It was important to me that I hit the aesthetics of the 40k universe, which means gothic arches. Drawing a gothic arch might seem difficult, but in reality it's really quite simple. Let me show you. I start by drawing a baseline that we will use as a guide. Then I add the sides or columns of the arches, making the three arches the same width. You take a compass and place the needle on one end of the baseline and the pencil on the other end. Then you simply draw an arc to the center of the arch. Switch it around and do the same thing from the other side. And now you have an equilateral gothic arch. That was simple enough, right? If you want to make a shorter arch, place the needle inside the arch, make the radius of the compass smaller, with the pencil at the other end of the baseline. Then you draw two arcs, just like we did before. This is called a dropped gothic arch. And conversely, if you want to make a taller arch, make the radius of the compass bigger and place the needle on the baseline outside the arch. This is called a lancet gothic arch. Now, if you want to draw something like a window frame or a door frame, simply increase the radius of the compass with the width of the frame. In my case, 0.5 centimeter. Place the needle in the same two positions that you did before and draw two new arcs. Now in these three examples, all of the arches had a specific width, but how do you know where to place the compass needle if you want the arch to have a specific height? Well, we start by drawing the baseline, and then we mark out the height in the middle of the baseline. Now we draw three circles with the same radius around the three outer points. The length of the radius isn't important, it just has to be long enough for the circles to intersect. So if you make it a little shorter than the height of the arch, you should be fine. Now the top circle will intersect with the two other circles at 2 points each. So we're gonna start by drawing a line through the two intersections between the top and the left circle, which will then intersect with the baseline. Then we draw another line through the two intersections between the top circle and the right circle, which will of course also intersect with the baseline. And this is where we will place our compass to finally make the arch. Now you know everything you need to make gothic arches. I ended up sketching 11 different designs and chose this one. To build it, I'd have to make the bulk of the wall and 2 layers on each side to create the gothic arches. To create the detail layers, I had the options of using either cardboard or XPS foam. Cardboard would be less susceptible to damage, but XPS foam would be easier to cut, and I could cut it to any thickness I wanted, so that's what I went with. But before I get into that, I have to make a little test. I'm gonna spread out some of the materials I might use on this piece of XPS foam. You see, I'll be creating a silicone mold later on, and I'll use a platinum cure silicone, which is great for reproducing details. It's very safe, there's pretty much no shrinkage, and it's easy to work with. However, there is one big problem. It's really sensitive to contamination, which means it refuses to cure if it gets into contact with the wrong stuff. So it's a good idea to test if there are any weird interactions between the products you're gonna use. The super glue I'm testing is a foam-safe super glue. Let me show you what happens if you use regular super glue with foam. I'll try a gel super glue and a thin super glue. It takes a little longer, but eventually the gel super glue melts the foam too. So that's why I need a foam-safe superglue. Everything is dried, so let's mix up some silicone. For this test I don't need much, so I'm gonna mix a small batch. This silicone uses a ratio of 1:1 of either weight or volume. Then I stir the silicone until it's a uniform color and I pour it over the test piece. Now we'll let that cure for about half an hour. I used my Proxon hot wire table to cut some 1mm thick sheets of XPS foam. I'm deliberately making them a little bit taller and wider than I want the end result to be. You'll see why later. Then I used a marker to mark out some guidelines for the design, being very careful not to leave an indent in the foam, because every groove and notch I make now will be transferred to the silicone mold later on and eventually to the final models. The problem is I can't actually see if I'm scoring the lines into the foam, so I won't find out until I pour the silicone. And that's a problem because I only have enough silicone to create one mold. About 10 years ago I picked up this circle cutter, which is basically a compass with a knife blade instead of a pencil. Unfortunately, it couldn't cut anything thicker than a piece of paper, so it ended up in a box in the attic. But it turns out it's great for cutting thin sheets of XPS foam, so I used it to cut out the arches. To make the straight cuts I used a ruler and an X-Acto knife with a fresh blade. The 4 layers are finally done, but before I start gluing them in place, I need to check the silicone test. There was a little bit of a reaction with the superglue, but the rest of it was perfectly fine, so I won't use superglue to assemble the walls. Instead, I'll use regular white glue. Unfortunately, I'd made too many marks on the front of the layers, so I decided to flip them around where they were relatively unharmed. The only issue is that the cuts are slightly tilted, so that's going to create a bit of overhang that might cause a problem later on. Then it was simply a question of applying some glue to the foam and gluing them in place one by one, letting each one dry before proceeding to the next one. Each time I'd put some weight on top of the foam, which would squeeze out some of the glue, so I made sure to clean it up before it dried. In my earlier build, I stabilized the walls by adding a base so they wouldn't fall over. This, of course, means that they can feel a bit out of place on battlefields that don't match the base theme. So with these new walls, I wanted to try another technique and add buttresses, which will give them a bigger footprint and concentrate the weight towards the bottom. The heavier weight and bigger footprint will hopefully mean that they're not as easily knocked around as my earlier foam walls. I made a bunch of different designs and chose the one I felt had the right proportions. Then I cut off the sides of the length of foam and the top as well. Then I sliced the foam like a salami to make a bunch of buttresses. I thought they looked a little bit boring, so I cut out some small gothic arches and glued them on the front of the buttresses, using the same technique as before. One of the issues of using a hot wire table is that it isn't as precise as you might think, amongst other reasons because the wire and the arm bend when you are cutting the foam. So things are always a little bit off, which in most cases doesn't mean a lot, but if you're trying to be exact it can cause a few problems. Like here, where my cuts are a tiny bit off so the layers aren't completely aligned. But this is why I made them a little bit bigger than they needed to be. So I'm gonna trim down the sides, and if there are any gaps left I'm going to fill those up with wall filler. As I suspect might happen, I could feel the wire dragging on the dry glue and the cuts ended up being a little bit wavy. It's not too bad, so I'm just gonna ignore it and hope it's not too visible in the final result. Now that's done, it's time to add some rivets. Note to self, remember to put a rubber band around this box of beads. Of course, there's no actual functional need to add rivets to a concrete wall, but as the imperial regulations will tell you, fewer than 27 rivets per square meter is technically architectural heresy and makes any construction 374% more likely to collapse, explode, or attract a gene stealer infestation. For the rivets I'm using 2mm flatback beads, and I'm attaching them to the wall by placing a dot of diluted white glue with one paintbrush, and then using another paintbrush dipped in glue to pick up and place the rivets. Finally, I glued the buttresses in place and the prototype is done. Now it's time to create the mold. I made a box out of XPS foam to fit the wall. I was a little impatient, so I used hot glue to assemble the box, which wasn't the best idea because hot glue is quite thick, so it left some small gaps between the parts of the mold. Because silicone is quite wobbly when it's cured, I made sure the box was sturdy so I can reuse it in the future to support the silicone mold so it doesn't warp when I fill it with plaster. Fits perfectly. I cut up a piece of cheap foam core to act as a bottom for the mold. I'd only need it when pouring the silicone, so it wasn't necessary to use XPS foam. Then I poured some grains into the mold to measure the volume so I'd know how much silicone I'd need. I glued the wall to the foam core to make sure it wouldn't move when I pour the silicone. The last time I poured silicone, I discovered that my table is in fact horribly warped. So to make sure the mold would be level when I poured the silicone, I took a block of XPS foam and propped it up until it was level. I placed the bottom and the wall on top of a block of foam and put the box over it, leaving about 1 centimeter of empty space between them to pour the silicone into. Then I glued them together using hot glue, doing my best to ensure that there weren't any holes for the silicone to leak out of. I then mixed the amount of silicone that I'd need and poured it into the mold in a thin stream from a great height, which would hopefully prevent air bubbles from forming. A while later, the silicone had cured and thankfully there hadn't been any leaks. I removed the foam core bottom, cut away the excess silicone, and used my hot wire to cut open the box in a wavy pattern so the two halves would fit back into place. I had hoped that the silicone would be flexible enough that I could just pull the model out of the mold, but I simply couldn't get it out without potentially damaging the silicone. So I decided to cut it open. I've never tried that before, so of course I was a little bit worried that I might ruin the mold. I put the silicone under tension and then I used an X-Acto knife to make a zigzag cut down both sides of the mold. Like with the box, the zigzag pattern helps the two sides lock back together again. Once I got the mold cut open, I could remove the wall without any issues. For it being my first time, I was pretty happy with the cuts I'd made. The mold turned out great, even though there were a couple of bubbles here and there. I think they got caught in the mold because of the overhangs I created when I flipped over the layers of XPS foam. Okay, now it's time to take the mold for a spin and cast the first wall. I stuffed the silicone mold back into the XPS box to prevent it from warping when I fill it with plaster. I put a bunch of rubber bands around the box to hold the two sides together, and I did my best to even out the seam. This is square wire mesh. We're gonna use it as rebar for our concrete walls. So when I break the walls apart, the rebar will become visible and chunks of wall is gonna stick to it. I'm pretty sure it's gonna look really cool. And here's a little trick I accidentally discovered. If you take a length of wire mesh, cut out a single wire and wrap it around a cylinder like a pen, you get some quick, easy and cheap barbed wire. And back to the action. I made 2 blocks of XPS foam to hold the wire mesh in place while I pour the plaster. I made sure the mold was level so the walls wouldn't end up leaning to one side. To make the walls light grey instead of white, I mixed water with black paint in a ratio of 300 milliliters of water to 10 drops of black paint. Then I mixed some plaster into the black water, sprayed the mold with water to help the plaster get into all the nooks and crannies, positioned the rebar, and poured the plaster into the mold. I shook the mold to help air bubbles escape and to level the plaster. Then I topped off the plaster and scraped off the excess. After it had set, I could finally demold the first cast. This looks fantastic. I'm extremely happy with how it turned out. I cut off the bits of rebar sticking out and removed the excess plaster. I had to dig into the plaster a bit to remove the mesh so it wouldn't harm the table. The plaster still felt wet, so I decided I'd cast a bunch of them and leave them to dry for a couple of days. Some of the models still had this seam where I cut the silicone mold, but since plaster is quite soft, it was easy enough to even out. And now it's time to get them painted up. I took this wall outside and sprayed it beige with a rattle can. I wanted the top half to be light and the bottom half to be blue, so I ran some good masking tape along the middle of the wall to get a nice straight edge. Wrapped the bottom half in cling film and used some cheap masking tape to make sure there weren't any gaps. I then realized I'd masked off the wrong half of the wall, so I started over and masked off the top half instead. When I was done correcting my mistake, I sprayed the bottom half blue and gave it a coat of matte varnish with a rattle can and removed the masking tape and cling film. Next I'm gonna do some weathering using streaking grime. One is close to black and the other is a reddish brown. I start out by trying them both on a small area to see how I like the colors. I apply the wash with a cheap synthetic paintbrush and then remove the excess with a makeup sponge. I didn't really like the look of the black wash, so I continued with the brown one. These are enamel washes. If you don't know what that is, it's basically an oil-based wash, as opposed to the washes you might know from Games Workshop, which are water-based. While water-based washes will dry within a few minutes, enamel washes can usually be manipulated for hours until they're fully cured, though in this case they did seem to dry faster than usual. Since water has high surface tension, water-based washes can sometimes form droplets and leave splotchy tide marks that look like coffee stains. Enamels and oil washes have low surface tension, so they don't suffer from those issues, and they will easily flow into recesses, panel lines, and around details. Here I went a little overboard and couldn't remove as much as I wanted with the makeup sponge, so I took one of my cheap synthetic paintbrushes and dipped it in odorless thinner. The odorless thinner dissolved the enamel wash and allowed me to pull it back until I got the effect that I was going for. And this is really the strength of enamel and oil washes, that you can go back and forth until you get the desired effect. My goal was to accentuate the details and the surface imperfections, but I also just wanted it to look dirty, as if rust and dirt had collected on the surface and rainfalls had dragged it down to create subtle streaks. So to create that effect, I'm mostly working in an up and downwards motion. I really like the grimy and grimdark look you get from enamel washes. This is what it looked like before, and this is after about 10 minutes. Next I decided to try the oil dot technique, which I haven't done before. I take a couple of oil paints and squeeze out a tiny amount on a piece of cardboard, which will soak up some of the excess oil. Then I place a bunch of tiny dots of each color along the bottom of the model. This technique is usually used for color modulation, which means to create subtle variations in a color, but I wanted to see if I could use it to create another layer of dirt and grime and to simulate algae growing near the ground. I'm using a brush that's damp with enamel thinner and working the oil paints up and down like I did previously. The effect seems quite subtle, but definitely something that's worth exploring more in the future. It was finally time to make them look worn and battle damaged. I took a piece of concrete and started bashing the plaster with it, making the surfaces and the edges looking rough and worn. Then I took a couple of screwdrivers and an awl to make bullet holes. This was simply a question of hacking the screwdriver into the plaster and giving it a twist to round out the hole. To make the holes look less perfect and as though the impact had chipped away some of the concrete, I used the awl to roughen up the edges of the hole as well as simulating damage from small caliber firearms. Now let's do some serious damage to this wall. The plaster was still soft enough that I could break it fairly easily, but after trying it again a couple of weeks later, I discovered that the plaster eventually becomes so hard that I couldn't avoid also tearing the wire mesh apart. This looks epic. This is exactly what I hoped would happen. The rebar is clearly visible and we have these big chunks of concrete hanging off the rebar. It really looks like it belongs in the middle of a war zone. I'll paint the rebar with Rust by Dirty Down, which is a fantastic effect paint. And now it's time to take a look at the final result. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.